Thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. I feel privileged to be in this profession of filmmaking where we can create experiences where people from different perspectives and different points of view have an opportunity to coexist and discuss their differences. And I just wanted to say that there are a lot of people here who are in the film, and that's very exciting for me. Some of them have never seen the film before. And I want everyone here to know that the people who you will see on screen, whether I agree or disagree with what they have to say in this film, I have the deepest respect for them. And my belief as an artist and as a filmmaker is that our responsibility is to create these spaces for dialogue. So thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the film. Please.
What are your mom's opinions?
What are my mom's opinions was the question. And yeah, she's conspicuously absent from the film and from the screening. And I think if I had to sort of assign one of the views in the film that's the closest to what she thinks, it would probably be Rabbi Warsh's opinion, which is that this is something that God tells us to do and we don't question what God tells us to do. Please.
Who would you like to see this film?
The question was, who would I like to see this film? That's a good question. Who do I think this film is relevant to is another way of phrasing that. And I think that, first of all, it's definitely relevant to anyone who's planning on having children, especially male children. So I think expectant parents, this would be a good film to see. But I think really, and that's sort of the broadest sort of audience for the film, but for me, the film is really about what you do when your ethics conflict with your religious tradition. That's really what this film is about for me. And so the sort of sweet spot, as far as I'm concerned, for who should be seeing this film are people who are interested in thinking about religion, not as a sort of revealed, sort of literalist, fundamentalist concept of what religion is, but people who believe that the human enterprise should play a central role in the development of religion.
Have you had screenings where, I mean, obviously this is, and I think we see it in the movie, that people are going to either have a very visceral opinion of it or learn something new. Have you had screenings where people have been either very negative or, have you had that kind of reaction?
So the question is if we've had screenings where people have had a very negative reaction to the film. And this may be a function of the fact that we haven't had a lot of screenings, but thankfully I can say that no, actually I've never had that experience, or we haven't had it yet, let's put it that way. I've been getting a lot of negative reactions from people who are reading certain things that have been written in the press about the film. And the sort of bulk of negative reactions, and I include hate mail in that, have come from people who haven't seen the film. Please.
Is there anybody that you shot for the film that has expressed their regrets at their participation?
The question is if there's anyone who I shot in the film who has expressed regrets in their participation in the film. Not yet. And I hope that doesn't change, but you never know. Yes, please.
With the exception of your mom, was there anybody you wanted to be in the film that you just couldn't get or convince to be in the film, or were so opposed to the idea they weren't even willing to be on film?
The question is, with the exception of my mother, who I've already stated refused to be in the film, is there anyone else who I wanted to be in the film who I couldn't get? And that's a question that sort of, at some point this should come up. This was a very, very low budget film. I think low budget is sort of, that may be a nice way of saying it. It was a shoestring budget. And there were a lot of things that if I had a little bit more money, maybe I would have been able to do. maybe some more experts. The man who I referred to in the article who did the groundbreaking research on the histology of the foreskin lives in Canada. We just couldn't make it up there. He would have, I think, been interesting to talk to. But I think overall, I'm pleased with the diversity of perspectives that I was able to collect and present. So, you know, having more money, I probably would have just spoken to more people, but I think ultimately, I think I'm pretty happy with what we were able to achieve. Oh, yes,
I'd like to make
ma'am.
a comment about the time it took for your father to, I guess I want to say come around, to broaden his opinion. It looked like he had about a year to think about it, with lots of conversation. And I'm thinking about your audience of expectant parents, that might be too short a time and too tense a time for them to process all of this. You might want to target a younger audience who are thinking about having children, but not yet pregnant. It's too hard to fight your way through an entire pregnancy over such a hot issue.
That's a very interesting comment. The comment was that perhaps instead of targeting expectant parents, maybe that's too late. Maybe we should be looking to talk about the film to young couples. And it's a very good point. And one of the people who we interviewed who didn't make the final cut of the film was a psychologist named Ronald Goldman, who has he's a Jew who has written about being Jewish and being uncomfortable, again an understatement, with circumcision. And one of the things that he told me was that when he counsels young couples who are looking to get married, as a psychologist, he tells them to talk about this before they commit, that they should talk about the issue of circumcision before they actually commit to being in a long-term relationship. And so I think that that's a very good point. Yes, please.
Do you think the film is well balanced between the different opinions, and do you think a documentary needs to give equal time to all opinions?
So the question is, do I feel that the film is well balanced, and do I feel that in general documentaries need to give equal time to all points of view to be considered balanced? This is a good question. I don't like to get into sort of semantic discussion. So let me start by saying that I think good documentaries exhibit passion for a subject. And I feel that anyone who has a certain degree of passion or enough passion to make a feature-length film about a subject shouldn't artificially conceal their opinions on that subject. Having said that, one of the things that I really strived for in this film is to, like I said before, create a space for people of multiple and indeed opposing opinions to coexist and have a dialogue about a subject. And that's what I tried to do with the film, and I think I achieved that. I believe I achieved that without having to artificially sort of conceal my own opinions. As I said before, I have a deep amount of respect for everyone who is in this film, including the people that I disagree with, including the ones I disagree with very strongly. But it's, you know, I think that you can have a sort of false notion of balance, and we see this in the media all the time, where you sort of have two talking heads with sort of opposite views who sort of say their piece for like 60 seconds, and that's supposed to be some sort of balance. To me, that's a very unsatisfying viewing experience, and I try to avoid that kind of balance in this film.
How do you plan on marketing this film?
The question is, how do we plan on marketing the film? Well, this is my first feature film, and I've been learning a lot. And I think that we're trying to look at certain demographics, certain groups of people that would be most interested in the film. And I'm learning that this is a good way to go about things. You know, not sort of just sending a message out to a bunch of people who may or may not be interested, but figure out the people who probably would be interested and target them. And so for us, you know, we have a number of groups of people that we think might be interested in the film, and we're sort of going after them selectively. Yes, sir.
Hi. Just it's a comment which is a think that before you decide on that, you have to decide whether this is an educational film or a documentary. As an educational film, I feel it's subversive. As a documentary, it's a work of art, and you're entitled to do whatever you like with it. I don't think it's an educational film.
So the comment is about the marketing of the film, and what Rabbi Warsh is saying is that before we start marketing the film, we should figure out whether it's a documentary or an educational film, and he feels that we should call it a documentary, and I agree. I mean, I think that there are educational elements about it. I tried to make it as informative as possible because I'm aware of the fact that the subject is one that is shrouded in myth, and hence the subtitle of the film, Slicing Through the Myths of Circumcision. But I agree, I very much consider this to be a documentary, and I hope people realize that when they see it. Yes?
This is kind of a related question. I know that for me, the two most powerful scenes and disturbing scenes were the actual portrayal, or not portrayal, the actual showing of the circumcision. And I know that sometimes, I was wondering, did you wrestle with including an actual scene of that, or was that, yes, we need to have that as an element of the documentary?
The question is whether the circumcision scenes were always going to be there. Is that?
Yeah, or was there a concern that having that imagery, the imagery would be so powerful, the sight and the sound would be so powerful that it would detract from the rational dialogue?
Right. Was there a concern about the emotional impact of showing the actual procedure? No. I thought that was very important. In fact, it was a big struggle to make the film, to get it completed. And one of the things that I felt I held out for was showing actual circumcisions. And I think it needs to be seen, and I think it needs to be seen in the way I showed it. I like to think of there actually being 3 circumcisions in the film. The first one where Moshe Kushner goes, "This is the penis, this is the organ," he says, right? And he uses his finger and he does sort of, he does like an air circumcision. And then the Orthodox circumcision of that my aunt did to her son, and then the final circumcision at the end with the Weber Shifrins. And I think that all of them were important. And yeah, I mean, I feel that it needed to be there so that people could understand why this is an emotional issue, and why it's not a minor issue, but it's actually a pretty big thing. Yes?
Questioning whether the medical effects, positive or negative, there's research still going on, and whether there's enough medical effect information available to help make a decision about this thing. The religious side seems to ignore that completely, I believe. An Orthodox Jew will have a circumcision performed on the boys. But having read one article was mentioned in the movie, New York Times, last Friday, and I meant to bring this to you, was a fairly long article about Africa and AIDS. And the medical side is presented in the article suggests it's a very important part. Circumcision is playing a very important role in reducing that situation in Africa.
Okay, so the question is about the recent research that's been coming out of Africa about HIV and male circumcision. And the first thing I want to say about that is that I think we really need to look at these sort of health claims in the context of the history of American circumcision. And one of the things that we see in the history of American circumcision is that every generation, like we showed in the film, tries to come up with a sort of another reason to continue doing circumcision. So that context is very important to keep in mind. But more to the point, I think that the studies in Africa are they're a sort of desperate attempt to do 2 things. Number one, it's sort of an indicator of how desperate the World Health Community is to do anything that could have any kind of effect on the AIDS epidemic, and that's a real sign of desperation that they're willing to start cutting off body parts in order to achieve something like that. And the second point is the desperation of some, very motivated people in the health community to continue finding reasons to continue this practice. And I tend to downplay the economic motivation for this, but it is an industry. There is a circumcision industry. There's an industry for making the tools. Doctors make money off of them. So I also, finally, on this point, want to raise serious doubts as to the basic logic behind using the African studies to justify neonatal routine infant circumcision, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with a completely different ethical circumstance. If you're talking about an adult male who is willingly going to get circumcised because he feels that it'll have some sort of protective effect, that's one thing. But to me, the central ethical issue of doing this to babies is that of consent. And I think that you can't sort of take a study about what consenting male adults do to try and help them prevent getting a sexually transmitted disease and say that that somehow applies to doing something to someone who doesn't have the ability to consent. Yes?
The main dialectic of the movie is fundamental human rights, namely body integrity and the opportunity to make choices about your own fate, which a child of 8 days certainly doesn't have, versus someone's religious perspective. I don't know if this is just too obvious a point, but it's just that rather than someone just saying, this is my religious point of view, this is what I will do, you can also make the argument that the ability to practice religion freely is a fundamental human right. So what do you do? What kind of analysis do you make when you have two essentially fundamental human rights butting up against each other in so direct fashion?
This is an excellent question. The question is, one can not only look at the right of an individual to make decisions on their body as a fundamental human right, but one can also look at the right of groups to practice their religion freely and consider that as a right that needs defending. And what do you do and how do you negotiate a situation in which these two rights conflict? And I think that's an excellent question. This is a discussion that we all should be having. I will say that there's a double standard in the way our culture treats male bodies and female bodies with regard to this issue. It is federally illegal to make any kind of incision or cut on a baby girl, and I think this is a good thing. I think it should stay that way, obviously. And male circumcision is something that people do all the time, and we still have a sort of I think it's close to 60% circumcision rate in this country. So, and the reason I bring up female cutting is because there are cultures and religions in the world who believe that cutting female genitalia is an important part of their tradition. So what I would say is it's a very important discussion that we need to have more vocally. I do think there should be consistency in the law about it, though. Yes?
Why do you think the practice is so much more common among non-Jews in the United States versus other countries?
The question is, why do I think the practice is so much more common among non-Jews in the United States than in other countries? And I think that really has to do with issues of conformity. I think circumcision reached a critical mass in this country after the Second World War. And, well, yeah, I'd say it passed the 50% mark after the Second World War. And then in the sort of 70s and 80s, it was at like 80%. It's been declining since then for a number of reasons. Some would attribute the decline of circumcision in this country since the 80s to something that we referred to in the film, the 1999 American Academy of Pediatrics decision or policy statement about circumcision, which wasn't sort of, it was a very kind of politically savvy sort of writ statement, which is interesting in and of itself, but it was reaffirmed in 2005, and the idea is basically that we do not recommend routine neonatal infant circumcision. That policy actually, interestingly, as a side point, is being reviewed now in light of the African studies, but the director has been quoted as saying he's not terribly uncomfortable with the wording of the policy statement from 1999 that was reaffirmed in 2005. But I really think it's just a matter of critical mass, and I think that A large part of it has to do with myths about circumcision and hygiene, and to a large extent, Daddy wants his son to look like him. I think that's really what it comes down to in this country. Yes?
As this film is certainly a struggle, it seems to us, the audience, for you to figure out why, in your own words, your father did this to you. I wonder if having made the film, the process of making it has helped you in any way to achieve any kind of personal reconciliation.
The question is, has the process of making the film helped me to achieve any sort of reconciliation with my struggle? And I think what I say at the end is still how I feel. It's given me clarity in thinking about my feelings about circumcision and how it relates to my understanding of Jewish identity. And I think actually that I've developed, since I've completed the film, I've started to develop a sort of more systematic understanding of what it is that I'm saying and the implications of what I'm saying for, relating to religion as a person living in the 21st century. So those processes have definitely taken place as a result of my making the film. Yes?
I think there's actually a much larger theme that this film addresses, which is what role do we allow large ideologies, be they political, religious, medical, which you bring up in the film, to play in our individual lives. And I'm wondering, why you focused on the religious ideology, and when the medical ideologies came up, they were sort of touched on and sort of challenged, but really not pushed to the extent that the imbalance asks us to push. And secondly, if you have any further plans for a next documentary where you're going to address a similar sort of theme under that.
So the question is about the balancing of the elements in the film. Why is it that I decided to focus on the religious ideology as opposed to other social ideologies that may come into play in this practice, and then whether or not I'm going to be focusing on this sort of an issue in a future project. To the first question, as a filmmaker, I found the issues of identity and religious struggle more interesting and more dramatic than a sort of scientific question or a sort of social science analysis of the factors that go into why we still do this in this country. And I think they're interesting, and I tried to give them the sort of due relative to how interested I was in those issues. I've sort of come to a lot of interesting conclusions, and you start to notice things, having done the research, like the sort of extreme and almost blindfolded double standard that the World Health community has to male circumcision compared to female circumcision. You notice things in the news, and you start to be a little uncomfortable about the way things are talked about. But I really think that in terms of grist for an interesting conflict that would be interesting in a film, the question of how we deal with the conflict between ethics and religious tradition that's what's really interesting to me, and so that's why that was the main focus of the film. Yes?
One of the things that you don't seem to address, but seems to always be hovering outside of the frame, is that circumcision is really only the first of a long line of things that we do to our children in the name of bringing them up in a certain religious tradition. And taken in that context, do you think that, circumcision is still like such a paramount topic to be discussed? Or when you see it in, we withhold certain dietary foods to our children if that's what we feel is important. We raise them and spend a huge amount of money sending them to certain schools where a lot of people will claim they were indoctrinated for decades into a certain religious tradition, where they might find that equally, if not more traumatic in terms of their overall, life cycle. And taken into that context, maybe some people might actually view circumcision as relatively, minor.
The question is about the relative importance of circumcision in relation to all of the other horrible things that we do to our children. And yeah, I mean, we do a lot of horrible things to our children. I think circumcision is unique in the Jewish tradition to this day, in that it's a commandment for which Jews are obligated to cause bodily harm to their children, which to me doesn't make it any more traumatic in the grander scheme of things necessarily than other sorts of psychological traumas that we may inflict on our children, but it does make it obvious. And it therefore, to me, serves as a metaphor for all of those larger issues. I also think that when talking about these sorts of issues, there are certain things that are much easier to not do than others. And I think it's much easier to not cut the end of your son's penis than, say, to sort of figure out a way to negotiate how not to cause him trauma being raised in a particular religious tradition. And so for me, the notion of drawing a red line around the human body as an ethical practice is one that should be adopted by everyone. Yes?
You've been mentioning the comparison between male circumcision and female circumcision. And I think one complicating factor that, obviously it's not an issue that's necessarily addressed so directly in the film, but just in discussion here, is that in a lot of circumstances, the sociological reasons for female circumcision get tied up with male-dominated society and basically subjugation of women. Whereas, the countries wherein male circumcision is, or the practices and the traditions wherein male circumcision is common, those men aren't subjugated. Men aren't victimized by their societies in general. They tend to actually be the victimizers. So how does that play into making just a one-on-one comparison between male circumcision and female circumcision?
The question is about the comparison between male circumcision and female circumcision, and it's a very important question because it must be stated vociferously that the vast majority of female circumcisions are more radical procedures than male circumcisions, and that they lead to more health complications, and that they're tied into male-dominated societies and can be looked upon as an expression of male dominance and subjugation of women. And I absolutely accept all of those ideas. However, and just as you're saying this thought pops into my head, there have been recent studies actually in Africa, sort of follow-up studies to the ones that have been released about HIV, in which we see that African women who are partnered with circumcised men actually are now reporting to have a higher incidence of sexually transmitted diseases and sort of sexually related relationship problems as a result of the fact that the men who are circumcised in Africa now feel that this is not something that they have to worry about. So it's sort of an interesting inverse effect that's happening there. But ultimately, the comparison between male circumcision and female circumcision is valuable insofar as we can see the double standard. And there is a double standard. And I think that ultimately a person's human right to a full sexual experience shouldn't be determined by their gender. Yes?
In the Jewish world, the need to do a circumcision, that's not going to change because it was within antiquity. But within the medical world, like you were saying, every decade or so they come up with a new reason for why we need to do a circumcision. So I was wondering how your theory on when that's going to change and where it's going to come from, because I feel that if something's been done medically for such a long time, no one wants to say, oops, our mistake, you lost bits of your penis for no good reason. So do you think that it's going to come from the medical world in however number of years, or is it going to have to be from individuals, non-Jewish people I'm referring to, being educated and telling their doctors, no, I don't want to do this. It might make you a lot of money, but I'm not interested in subjecting my child to this because I don't see a good reason for it anymore. Do you think that's ever going to change, or do you think they're just going to keep throwing out new studies about why it's good?
The question is, states that the state of circumcision in the Jewish tradition isn't likely to change in the future, and I'm not going to disagree with that. It probably won't, although I think it could, which I think is important to say. and I'll get back to that in a second. But the bulk of the question is how and whether I think the medical community is ever going to come around on the issue of circumcision. I think largely the medical community, the world medical community, has come around on this issue. I think the United States is a very interesting exception and a very influential exception. But if you look at recent policy statements from pediatric associations from Australia to Canada, most countries in the world have sort of come to the realization that this is really an unnecessary procedure which leads to the suffering of untold hundreds of thousands, if not millions. What's going to happen in the United States is going to be interesting to watch. Part of the reason that this is such a live wire topic right now is because it's being fought over politically by sort of the vocal, small but vocal, thankfully, minority of anti-circumcision activists or intactivists, and people who are trying to continue this practice. I don't know what the future is going to bring. I could see circumcision sustaining itself for hundreds of years to come. It's sustained itself this long, and I think that says something very interesting about science and about the way we encode our sort of practices in scientific or so-called scientific terms. Yes?
What would you think would be the youngest age for consent from a child?
The question is, what do I think the youngest age for consent for a child should be? And I think that it should be consistent with other laws of consent. Probably 18 would be acceptable to me, but that's sort of that would be a legal question. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to come back to the issue of whether this is going to continue in the Jewish world. Yeah, I think it likely is going to continue in the Jewish world. You know, I don't want it to. I think that that the Jewish tradition is flexible enough to deal with a way of sort of writing this out of mandatory tradition. I think that's absolutely within the scope of what the Jewish tradition could achieve. I think that, moreover, that that when religion fails to come to terms with the ethical issues of the day, it fails to be relevant. And so I hope that there will be some change on this issue. And I really do feel, having been through the process of making this film and talked to many, many Jews about this, I think that the majority of Jews would not like to take the position that Rabbi Warsh presents. I don't think that people are comfortable saying that the human enterprise doesn't have a role to play, or an important role to play, in religious tradition. So I actually think that there's the potential there. Whether or not it's going to happen, it's anyone's guess. Yes?
It was commented earlier that this film is not necessarily an educational film, and I think that it should be noted that it's a tool for education, and I think it's important that when you bring up issues in a community that are commonly practiced, the people need a voice and need to know the questions to ask in order to talk about it. So even though it's still a documentary, I think it's important to note that it can be used for educational purposes and can further give voice to these issues that we face in our lives on a consistent basis. I also want to know from you if you feel like Judaism can one day, we don't necessarily have to do this practice. From your perspective, then what would you say would be a good substitute to do action and prove that as humans we're in a covenant with God?
So the question is, if I think that one day this shouldn't be practiced in the Jewish tradition, what would I suggest as a substitute for the practice to say somehow that we're in covenant with God? I think what comes immediately to mind is that girls don't do this, and they're still considered to be part of the covenant as far as I understand it, unless you want to go with some sort of extremely misogynistic interpretation of the way Judaism looks at women, which some might, but I don't. So I think that the sort of generational aspect of circumcisions, the sort of bringing together generations aspect of it, can be achieved without actually cutting baby penises. And I believe that probably something akin to what's going on in very sort of small numbers right now, what's called Brit Shalom, where there's sort of a naming ceremony, which is a mirror of the female birth naming ceremony that we have in Judaism that's been developing over the last 100 years. I think that would be appropriate. Yes?
From your own, I guess, just anecdotal experience, would you say that there was a difference at all between the way the men and women that you spoke to approached the issue of circumcision, or was there basically consent? Were there different opinions based on gender?
The question is whether or not the reactions or the way people dealt with circumcision trended in a gender direction. And the answer is no. I was interested to see that there were women in leadership positions on both sides of the issue, who were very passionate on both sides of the issue. I think ultimately this is really, it's like many things, it's just a matter of personality. And the individual, when in my anecdotal experience, it just has to do with what kind of a person I'm talking to. And I've seen men and women in sort of every shade of the spectrum on this issue. Yes?
Did you, what did you feel was the biggest challenge in pitting science against religion? Because one could come, for example, up with some medical metaphors where you're pitting science against science. Okay, the baby's being subjected to pain when he's getting surgery that is necessary or an injection, but we know scientifically we have data to prove that it's good. For a Jew who's giving his child a circumcision, he has a faith-based belief that he is doing good to his child in the long run, that it is on some equivalent to an inoculation, and that there's some sort of spiritual benefit. Did you find that there was a difficulty in presenting that aspect, this kind of larger conflict of science and religion?
The question is how making the film, I felt about the conflict between science and religion, and whether that came into play at all. And I don't think that, I mean, I see there are a lot of points at which science and religion have friction. I don't know that I would paint the picture of circumcision quite that way. I think that that there are definitely issues of science being raised about a religious issue here, and I think that the science that I presented in the film was really so that you can appreciate the level of loss that's occurring, because that's something that's sort of not dealt with a lot. But I think that issues like, evolution or creationism are sort of much hotter when it comes to those sorts of issues. Yes?
As I watched the film, you included a lot of great information, a lot of great background, the pros, the cons, experts on medical opinions, matters of faith. But to me, the central theme, and which you nicely bookended with your family, was your personal struggle. That was the most compelling element of it to me, not the argument pro, against, what have you. And what I'm wondering is if you encountered, in making the film, if you encountered other people having the same kind of struggle with this issue. And if you did you film them? And did you decide to include or not include for a particular reason?
The question is whether in the process of making the film I encountered other people who also were struggling with this issue. And, I'm always surprised when I bump into Jews who think critically about circumcision. And that's because most Jews that I know think very little about it, if at all. And I think most people think very little about circumcision. I just think it's one of those things that's under the surface of social conscience, social consciousness. And I'm trying to raise that to the surface, obviously, with making this film. I did meet some people after I finished making the film who sort of came out of the woodwork and were like, hey, you know what, we really kind of have been, we think this isn't such a great thing either, and we've been struggling with this. And but I didn't include that perspective, with the exception, as you said, of myself in the film, because, you know, in the process, in the 18 months it took me to make the film, I can't think of a single person that I met who was sort of struggling with this as a religious issue. That's just the way it happened. Yes. Hi, Richard.
I have a couple of comments. One is, I have seen this film 6 times, and this
You're crazy.
and committed to you. I've seen it 6 times. I think this was my most enjoyable time, and I think one of the reasons is it's so wonderful to see it the way you've edited it. I think you did a brilliant job of editing it to this length.
Thank you.
And seeing it in this venue, you know, is wonderful because you know, it has such wonderful production cuts that are able to be articulated. Now, I want to address Ken Drabick. You down there? Yay. And I've seen it a few times when you've been in the audience with me as well. I've never said anything, but I want to articulate it now. I am a just turned 61-year-old, although I don't look it, Jewish male. I was raised Reform, and so it was never an issue, and I was circumcised, and it wasn't a religious family, and then 13 years ago, I became very observant and very deeply into this covenant. So I want to say this to you. I thought, first of all, I've always enjoyed your role in this film. I think that your piece of this is well articulated and very well thought out. That said, in my view, and this is where I come out on it, that God is my composer and conductor, and my symphony has been complete. So, that's my statement, and I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Richard. Any other questions? Yes, right there. Please. Yeah.
I've seen this film twice. I saw it at the Well, and I loved seeing you and your father talk. I just wanted to let you know the love is evident, and it's such a privilege and joy to see a father and son interact like that. My question is, will this film ever be available as a DVD?
The comment was about the love between my father and I wish he were still here to hear that. Oh, hi, Papa. I thought you left. Oh, that's great. And the DVD, yeah, we're working on it. I'm going to be working around the clock for the next 4 weeks to put that together, so it will be available with extra features soon. Ron? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, of all the possible films you could have turned out as your first feature-length work, where do you think this one will take you in the future as a filmmaker? Are there things, you know, is it so controversial that it might exclude chances to work with certain organizations like CNN or something, or what's next?
What's next? What's the impact that this is going to have on my future career? I hope positive. I really hope that it's going to have a positive impact. I don't know. I'm a filmmaker and I'm an artist, and actually coming here is kind of like coming home because, like Jim said before, you know, this is where I learned what being an artist meant at the School of the Art Institute, and I make work that I think is interesting, compelling, and that I can't not make. And my next project has nothing to do with anything like this. In fact, it's not even going to be a documentary. I'm working on a narrative film on the subject of love. So I go where the tide takes me, and hopefully it'll work out. So thanks for asking, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your presence here.